I'll never forget the first time I laid my hands on the soil of my family's farmland. It wasn't just dirt, it was history. Generations of my family had walked these fields, planted crops, raised cattle, and built a life on this land long before I was even born. To me, the 3,200 acres weren't just acres. They were blood, sweat, and memory. My grandfather used to say, "This land isn't ours. We just borrow it from the generations before and protect it for the generations after." That saying became my compass. Every fence post I hammered, every row I tilled, every tree I watered, it all carried weight. This wasn't just a farm. It was a legacy. So imagine my shock when one ordinary afternoon, while I was sitting at my kitchen table sipping coffee and going through mail, I opened an envelope that would shatter everything I thought I knew. It was a notice of sale. According to the letter, my 3,200 acres had been sold at auction. The reason? Unpaid HOA dues totaling $847. At first, I thought it was a scam. I mean, my farmland, under an HOA? That was laughable. My land was agricultural, not residential. There wasn't a gated community for miles. No shared swimming pool. No neighborhood watch. No clubhouse. Just open skies and the sound of wind moving through the crops. But as I read and reread that notice, my hands began to tremble. My land, my grandfather's land, was gone. Transferred. Auctioned. Sold. I felt sick to my stomach. I stumbled out to the porch, looking out at the rolling fields that stretched beyond the horizon, and it felt like the ground beneath me had tilted. How could anyone, let alone an HOA, sell my property? That night, I barely slept. My mind kept racing, searching for answers. I dug through every deed, every tax record, every receipt I had, as if somewhere, somehow, I'd find proof that this was just a clerical error. By morning, I stormed down to the HOA office listed on the notice. It was a bland brick building tucked between a dentist's office and a nail salon. The kind of place you'd drive by without a second glance. Inside, I was greeted with the faint smell of coffee and toner. A receptionist sat behind a desk, typing lazily on a keyboard. "Can I help you?" she asked without looking up. "Yes," I said, slapping the notice down on the counter. "This says my farm was sold. You want to explain how that's possible?" She finally looked up, her eyes flicking over the paper. Then, without a hint of emotion, she said, "If it was sold, it must have been because of unpaid dues." "Unpaid dues?" I snapped. "Lady, my farm isn't part of your HOA. I never signed anything. I've never attended your meetings. I don't use your services. What the hell are you talking about?" Her shrug was infuriating. "If it was sold, it was sold. You'll have to take it up with the board." I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I demanded to see someone in charge, and after what felt like an eternity, I was ushered into a small conference room. There, 3 board members sat at a long table, 2 men in pressed shirts, and 1 woman with a smug smile plastered across her face. I explained everything, how my family had owned that farmland for generations, how it wasn't under their jurisdiction, how I owed them nothing. When I finished, the woman leaned forward and said, "According to our records, your property falls within the extended HOA boundaries that were voted on last year. You missed multiple notices about outstanding dues, and therefore, under our bylaws, we had the right to place a lien and auction the property." My jaw dropped. Extended boundaries? You can't just redraw a map and claim 3,200 acres of farmland belongs to you. "That's theft," she smirked. "You should have paid your dues." At that moment, I realized this wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. They had found some twisted loophole, or forged documents, or maybe just outright lied. But either way, they'd stolen my land right out from under me. The next few weeks were hell. I drove past my fields one morning only to find bright neon survey markers hammered into the soil. Trucks from a development company were parked along the fence line, and men in hard hats were unloading equipment. A "coming soon" sign had been planted by the road. Horizon Estates, luxury living on open land. I wanted to rip that sign out of the ground and smash it to pieces. Instead, I just sat there in my truck, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The farm my grandfather built with his bare hands was being chopped up, parceled out, and turned into subdivisions with cul-de-sacs and playgrounds. And I couldn't stop it. Not yet. I started digging. I went to the county records office, combed through land deeds, titles, and plats. I met with lawyers who specialized in property disputes. I even called the state attorney general's office. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became. The HOA had no legal standing. None. My farm was never within their jurisdiction. There were no valid liens. The so-called dues were fabricated. The entire sale was built on a foundation of lies. But here's the catch. Undoing it wouldn't be easy. Developers had already paid for the land. Contracts had been signed. Construction had begun. It was like trying to put toothpaste back in the tube. The emotional toll was brutal. I couldn't step onto the porch without feeling rage. Nights were sleepless, filled with visions of bulldozers tearing down my grandfather's barns and paving over our fields. Friends told me to move on. It's just land, they said. Buy somewhere else. Start fresh. But they didn't understand. You can't start fresh with history. You can't replace the sweat-soaked soil where your father taught you to drive a tractor, or the oak tree where your grandmother used to hang a tire swing. This was personal, and as much as they had stolen from me, I wasn't going to let them get away with it. The breaking point came one afternoon when I confronted a group of surveyors on the property. "Hey!" I shouted, stomping across the field. "You don't belong here. This is my land." One of them looked up, clearly annoyed. "Sir, we're just doing our job. You'll need to take this up with the developer." "My family's owned this land for over a century," I growled. "And you think you can just waltz in here because some crooked hoe says so?" The man didn't answer. He just went back to hammering in stakes, as if I didn't exist. That's when I knew. If I wanted justice, I'd have to take matters into my own hands. I wasn't just fighting for farmland anymore. I was fighting for principle. They thought they could take everything from me with the stroke of a pen, but they had no idea who they were messing with. And that was the moment my plan began to form. I didn't know all the steps yet. I didn't know how long it would take or how ugly it would get. But I made myself one promise that night as I stood on the porch, staring at the horizon where the sun dipped below my stolen fields. If they thought they could steal my land, I would take everything from them. When someone steals from you, the first thing you feel is anger. The second thing? Confusion. And for me, confusion quickly turned into obsession. Every morning, I'd wake up and march into town with a single mission: find the truth. The courthouse became my second home. I'd sit under the flickering fluorescent lights, stacks of property records spread out in front of me, and comb through line after line of legal jargon. I wasn't a lawyer, but after a few weeks of this, I felt like I could have passed the bar exam. The deeper I dug, the stranger it got. According to the county clerk's office, my farmland was never officially recorded as HOA territory. Not once. No plat maps showed it. No annexation agreements existed. On paper, I was the uncontested owner. So how had it been sold? That question burned like fire. One afternoon, as I was flipping through microfiche records, dusty documents dating back to the 1970s, I spotted something odd. A single-line item buried in a meeting note: vote to extend HOA jurisdiction to include neighboring parcels. At first glance, it looked official. But then I noticed. No signatures. No county approval. No registered notice of change. Just a typed line, as if someone had quietly slipped it into the minutes after the fact. Forgery. That's when the pieces started to click. This wasn't incompetence. It was fraud. I hired a lawyer named Daniel. He was a wiry man in his 40s with a sharp mind and a sharper tongue. When I dropped the notice of sale on his desk, he leaned back in his chair and let out a long whistle. "Well," he said, "if what you're telling me is true, this is the sloppiest land grab I've ever seen. Can we fight it?" I asked. He adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. "Of course we can fight it. The question is, how much time do you have?" Developers move fast. Once concrete gets poured, judges get nervous about undoing deals. I clenched my fists. "I'll give however much time it takes." I'm not letting them destroy my family's land. Daniel nodded slowly. Then we start here. He tapped the notice with a pen. First step, prove the hoe had no authority. Second step, trace the money. Because trust me, someone got paid for this. Tracing the money turned out to be like peeling back the layers of a rotten onion. Daniel subpoenaed bank records, and sure enough, there were irregular payments flowing into hoe accounts, checks that didn't match dues, deposits that came in large, round numbers. When we cross-referenced them with the timeline of the land sale, it all lined up. Developers had been greasing palms. I wasn't surprised, but I was furious. It wasn't enough that they stole my land. They'd sold it for a song and pocketed the difference. Around this time, neighbors started coming out of the woodwork. One evening, I was walking to my truck when a man from down the road, an older farmer named Henry, called out. "Hey," he said, lowering his voice. "You're fighting the hoe, right?" "Damn right I am." He glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. "Be careful. You're not the only one they've burned. Couple years back, they tried to take my cousin's lot. Claimed he'd violated some landscaping code. He ended up selling just to get them off his back." I frowned. "Did he fight it?" Henry shook his head. "Didn't have the stomach for it. But you've got the fire. Keep pushing." That small moment meant more than he knew. It told me I wasn't alone. As weeks passed, I gathered more stories. Families who'd been fined into bankruptcy over absurd violations, mailbox paint, lawn height, fence styles. People who'd been bullied, threatened, and pushed out. It became clear. My land grab wasn't an isolated case. It was the crown jewel in a long chain of abuse. The hoe wasn't just corrupt, they were predators. And predators thrive in silence. So I decided to make noise. I contacted the local newspaper. The reporter, a young woman named Marissa, met me at the diner one morning. She carried a notepad and a skeptical look. "Tell me why I should care," she said, pen poised. "Because if it can happen to me," I told her, "it can happen to anyone. They didn't just steal land. They stole history. They stole heritage. And they think they can get away with it because nobody's watching." She raised an eyebrow. "Do you have proof?" I slid a folder across the table, photocopies of forged minutes, bank records, and my deed. Her eyes widened as she flipped through. By the time she set the papers down, her skepticism was gone. "I'll run it," she said. "But you should prepare yourself. Once this hits print, they're going to come after you." I nodded. "Let them try." The article hit like a thunderclap. Local hoe under fire for fraudulent land sale. Suddenly, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Neighbors, reporters, even old college friends who'd seen the story online. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Was it true? And when I told them yes, the floodgates opened. More victims came forward. More stories spilled out. The hoe had always operated in the shadows, but now the spotlight was burning hot. And they hated it. It didn't take long before I started receiving threats. Anonymous letters in my mailbox. Strange cars parked near my driveway late at night. One evening, I even found my barn door pried open, tools scattered, as if someone wanted me to know they'd been there. I reported it all, but the sheriff just shrugged. "Hard to prove who's behind it," he said. "Hard to prove, maybe." But I knew. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about power, and they were terrified of losing it. One night, I sat on my porch under the stars, sipping black coffee, when my lawyer called. "You're not going to like this," Daniel said. "The developers filed a motion to accelerate construction. They're trying to argue that reversing the sale would cause irreparable harm to them financially. They want to get shovels in the ground as fast as possible." My stomach dropped. How fast? Weeks, maybe days. I stared out at the horizon, where my fields stretched into darkness. If I didn't stop them now, I might never get my land back. But that's when the idea struck me. So bold, so dangerous, I almost laughed at myself for thinking it. If the hoe could play dirty to steal my property, then maybe it was time I learned how to beat them at their own game. When you're fighting a battle this big, sooner or later you realize you can't do it alone. For weeks, I had been tearing through county records, meeting with lawyers, and gathering evidence. But every time I drove past my farmland and saw survey stakes in the ground, I felt the same sick churn in my stomach. The developers were moving faster than I was. That's when it hit me. If they could band together as an HOA board, rig the rules, forge documents, and push people out, then maybe I needed to fight back with something bigger than just myself. I needed an army. It started small. I called a few neighbors I trusted, people I knew had their own run-ins with the hoe. We met one evening in my barn, the scent of hay and motor oil thick in the air. At first, everyone was hesitant. People shifted in their chairs, arms crossed, eyes darting toward the floor. Finally, one woman named Clara spoke up. She was in her 60s, a widow who'd lived in the community all her life. "They fined me $300 for having a bird bath in my yard," she said bitterly. "Said it attracted mosquitoes. You know what I did? I paid it, because I didn't want them targeting me." Henry, the old farmer I'd spoken with weeks before, nodded. "That's how they operate. They pick one of us off at a time. Nobody wants to be the nail sticking out, 'cause that's the nail they hammer." I looked around the room. "Then maybe it's time we all stuck out together. They can't hammer all of us." The silence stretched for a moment. Then, slowly, heads began to nod. That night, we agreed we would fight back as a community. Word spread fast. Within a week, my barn was overflowing with people, farmers, retirees, young families, even a few local business owners. Some came with their own horror stories. A man named Eric described how the hoe had tried to fine him for leaving his truck parked in his own driveway. They said it looked unsightly. He scoffed. "It's a truck. In the country. What did they expect?" Another woman, Maria, shared how they'd threatened to foreclose on her home over supposed unpaid dues she swore she had receipts for. As the stories piled up, the anger in the room grew thick. People weren't just frustrated. They were humiliated, beaten down, afraid. And fear is exactly what the hoe thrived on. I stood up and slammed my hand on the table. "Enough. They've bullied us long enough. We're going to hit back. Not as individuals, but together." The room erupted in applause. We started organizing. First came documentation. Every person who'd ever been fined, threatened, or harassed by the hoe brought their paperwork. We stacked it into boxes, proof of years of abuse. Next came outreach. We set up a Facebook group and a mailing list. Clara's grandson helped design flyers, which we slipped into mailboxes and taped to bulletin boards at the grocery store and post office. "Know your rights," the flyers read. "Join us in standing up to hoe corruption." And people responded. Oh, did they respond? The first community meeting we held at the town's old church basement. I expected maybe 50 people. Instead, over 200 showed up. Families crammed into folding chairs, standing room only at the back. The air buzzed with a kind of nervous energy, the kind you feel right before a storm. I stepped up to the microphone, heart pounding. "I'm not a politician," I began. "I'm not a lawyer. I'm just a farmer. But what happened to me, what happened to my family's land, should never happen to anyone. They stole from me. And from what I've heard tonight, they've stolen from many of you too. They want us to believe we're powerless, that we can't fight them. But that's exactly how bullies win. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm done being bullied." Cheers filled the basement, echoing off the walls. That night, something shifted. It wasn't just my fight anymore. It was everyone's fight. Of course, the hoe noticed. Within days, we started receiving cease and desist letters, accusing us of defamation and conspiracy. The board even called a special meeting where they denounced our group as agitators spreading misinformation. But every time they tried to silence us, our resolve only grew stronger. Marissa, the reporter, kept covering the story. Local TV stations picked it up next. Soon, our fight was the talk of the county. The hoe had thrived in darkness. Now, they were burning under the spotlight. Still, they weren't going down without a fight. At one point, a family in our group, Eric and his wife, received an eviction notice, supposedly for violating hoe bylaws by storing firewood on their porch. Everyone knew it was retaliation. That night, dozens of us gathered outside their house. We formed a human wall around their porch, holding signs, "Stop Hoe Abuse." Homes, not hostages. The sheriff showed up, but when he saw the cameras rolling and the size of the crowd, he backed down. The eviction never happened. For the first time, people realized we had power when we stood together. Behind the scenes, Daniel kept working the legal angle. He filed injunctions, demanded audits, and pushed county officials to investigate. And then came the bombshell. One of Daniel's assistants stumbled on a paper trail, emails between a developer and the HOA president. They weren't just casual. They were damning. In one message, the developer promised compensation for ensuring the farmland sale went through quickly. Another outlined plans to neutralize local opposition. It was bribery, plain and simple. When Daniel showed me those emails, I felt a surge of vindication. Finally, concrete proof. But proof is only as strong as what you do with it. I decided to take it straight to the people. At our next town meeting, I projected the emails onto a screen for everyone to see. Gasps filled the room as folks read the words for themselves. "This," I said, pointing to the screen, "is what we've been up against. Lies, bribes, corruption. They didn't just want my land, they wanted all of us under their control. And they thought we'd stay quiet while they lined their pockets." The crowd roared with anger. That was the night the movement turned from a whisper into a shout. But the hoe wasn't finished yet. A week later, I got a call from Clara. Her voice was shaky. "They took my mailbox," she said. "What do you mean they took it?" "They ripped it right out of the ground. Said it wasn't regulation height." I closed my eyes and clenched my jaw. They were trying to intimidate us again, going after the most vulnerable in our group. That night, we replaced Clara's mailbox with a brand new one. Not just any mailbox, a towering, custom-painted one with "Community Strong" stenciled across the side in bold letters. When the hoe came by the next morning, cameras were already there. They didn't dare touch it. We were winning the small battles. But deep down, I knew the real war was still ahead. Because while the community was fired up, the developers were moving faster than ever. Driving past the farmland one morning, I saw bulldozers lined up like soldiers, engines rumbling, ready to tear into the soil. Construction trailers had been hauled in. The sign for Horizon Estates was bigger now, planted like a flag of conquest. My chest tightened. We had the people. We had the press. We even had evidence. But would it be enough to stop them before they destroyed everything? That night, I gathered with Daniel and a few close allies. The barn was dimly lit, papers scattered across the table. "We've made progress," Daniel admitted, "but litigation is slow. Even with these emails, it could take months, maybe years, for a full judgment. By then, the land will be gone. So what do we do?" I asked. He hesitated, then leaned in. "There is another way, risky. But if it works, it could flip this entire situation on its head." The room went quiet. Everyone stared at him, waiting. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "If they use the hoe to take what wasn't theirs, maybe it's time we use the hoe against them." The first time I walked into the county courthouse to fight the hoe, I felt like a farmer stepping into a coliseum. The walls were lined with polished wood, the air heavy with the smell of old books and dust. Suits and ties shuffled papers, whispered strategies, and shot me sideways glances like I didn't belong there. And maybe I didn't. I wasn't a lawyer. I wasn't polished. I was just a man fighting for his family's land. But I'll tell you this, I had something none of them had: fire in my gut. Our case was simple. The hoe had no jurisdiction. They forged records. They sold land they didn't own. On paper, it should have been open and shut. But the developers had money, and money buys time. Their lawyers filed motion after motion, drowning us in paperwork. They argued the sale was already complete, contracts binding, and reversing it would cause irreparable harm to the developer's business interests. Every word was like a knife twisting in my side. What about my harm? What about the generations of sweat poured into that soil? Still, Daniel was relentless. He stood in front of the judge, waving the emails we'd uncovered. "Your Honor, he said, voice sharp as steel. This is bribery. This is fraud. If this sale stands, then we may as well declare open season on every property owner in this county. Nobody's land would be safe. The judge frowned, clearly moved, but he didn't rule right then. He took it under advisement, which, as Daniel explained later, was judge speak for don't hold your breath. Meanwhile, the developers kept building. I'd drive past the fields and see more equipment, more foundations, more scars carved into the earth. It felt like watching a loved one slowly bleed out while the hospital argued over paperwork. At night, I'd sit on my porch, staring into the darkness, thinking about Daniel's words. Maybe it's time we use the hoe against them. At first, the idea seemed insane. Why would I want anything to do with the very organization that stole from me? But then I thought about it. The hoe was their weapon. They'd used it to seize land, intimidate neighbors, and line their pockets. But what if we flipped it? What if we turned their own weapon back on them? The more I considered it, the more it made sense. If I could buy property inside the hoe, I'd become a member. If enough of us did, we could vote. If we gained control, we could rewrite the rules, expose the corruption from the inside, and maybe even reclaim what was stolen. It was crazy, risky, expensive, but it might just work. I brought the idea to the group. We met again in the church basement, where the air was thick with anticipation. They used the hoe to take what wasn't theirs, I said, pacing in front of the crowd. But that same hoe could be their downfall. What if we infiltrated it? What if we became the majority? Murmurs spread through the room. Some people looked skeptical. Others leaned forward, intrigued. Henry was the first to speak. So, you're saying we buy in? Become members? Exactly, I said. One house, one vote. If enough of us own property inside, we control the board. We can demand audits. We can tear down their lies from the inside. Clara raised a trembling hand. But isn't that dangerous? What if they find out what we're doing? I took a deep breath. Then we make sure they can't stop us. The plan was bold, but it required money. More money than most of us had lying around. So we pooled resources. Some sold old equipment. Others dipped into savings. A few sympathetic business owners quietly chipped in. Even Marissa, the reporter, helped us set up a GoFund under the banner, Take Back Our Homes. Within weeks, we had enough to buy the first property, a foreclosed home on the edge of the hoe boundary. It was run down, paint peeling, weeds choking the yard. But to us, it was more than a house. It was a key. The day the deed was signed, I stood in the empty living room, sunlight streaming through broken blinds, and felt a surge of triumph. For the first time, the hoe couldn't ignore me. I was one of them now. Of course, they didn't welcome me with open arms. At the first home meeting I attended, all eyes turned as I walked through the door. The board members' smiles were tight, their voices clipped. Mr. Whitaker, the president sneered. To what do we owe this? Surprise. I smiled back, every bit as smug as they'd been to me months earlier. I'm a homeowner now. Thought I'd take an interest in community affairs. The room buzzed with whispers. From that moment on, I wasn't just an outsider screaming at the gates. I was on the inside. Meanwhile, Daniel kept hammering the legal case. He filed motions to freeze construction, citing the bribery evidence. He pushed for criminal charges against the board. And slowly, the pressure started to crack the facade. One board member, an older man with shaky hands, resigned suddenly, citing health reasons. Another stopped showing up to meetings altogether. It was clear they were scared. But scared animals are dangerous. One night, as I left the hoe office after a heated meeting, I noticed a car idling at the end of the street. Its headlights flicked on as I walked to my truck. I climbed in, heart pounding, and the car rolled slowly behind me as I drove home. When I pulled into my driveway, it lingered at the end of the road before finally disappearing into the night. I knew then that this fight wasn't just legal or political, it was personal. They wanted to intimidate me, break me, but they underestimated just how far I was willing to go. Weeks later, we made our second purchase. Then a third. Each new property meant another vote, another foothold. The board tried to block sales, but they couldn't stop the tide. Every meeting became more tense. Every time I raised my hand to vote, I could feel their control slipping. And then came the moment I'd been waiting for. Daniel called me one morning, excitement in his voice. "They've scheduled a special election," he said. "Too many vacancies. Too much bad press. They can't keep the board together." I froze, the weight of his words sinking in. A special election. This was it, the chance to take control of the hoe itself. But just as the pieces seemed to be falling into place, the developers made their boldest move yet. One afternoon, as I drove past the farmland, I nearly slammed on the brakes. Bulldozers were rolling, earth movers churning, and concrete trucks lined up. They weren't waiting for permits, for rulings, for justice. They were going to build, legal fight or not. I stood at the fence line, watching my family's soil ripped open, and made a vow. If the courts couldn't stop them and the board wouldn't stop them, then I would. The special election was the moment everything changed. For months, I'd been planting seeds, buying property, rallying neighbors, showing up at meetings no one thought I'd attend. And now, finally, the board's corruption had left them too weak to stand. Vacancies had piled up, and the bylaws were clear. When a board loses quorum, a special election must be held. They never expected someone like me to be waiting in the wings. That night, the church basement was buzzing. Flyers with bold black letters, "Take back our homes," were tacked on the walls. Farmers, small business owners, retirees, even young couples clutching babies filled the rows of metal chairs. I walked to the front, my boots heavy against the floor, and cleared my throat. "You all know why we're here," I began. "They stole from us, lied to us, sold off what was ours, and they think they can get away with it. But tonight, we take the first step to end this." A cheer went up, raw and angry. Daniel stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. "Remember," he said, calm but firm, "this isn't about revenge. It's about fairness. Justice. If we take the board, we control the rules. And if we control the rules, we can expose everything they've done." I looked out at the crowd. Faces were lit with hope, some with desperation. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't just my fight anymore. It was everyone's. The election wasn't held in a grand hall or courtroom. No, it happened in the drab community center of the Hoe, the same place they'd once mocked me as an outsider. But this time, I wasn't standing in the back. I was front and center, running for a board seat. The room was tense. On one side, the old guard, the developers' allies, realtors, and polished board members in crisp suits. On the other, us, the misfits, the farmers, the everyday folks they thought they could trample. The ballots were cast, counted, recounted, and when the final numbers were read, a silence fell. I had won. So had Henry. So had Clara. We didn't just win seats. We took the majority. The look on the Hoe president's face is one I'll never forget. A mix of shock, rage, and fear, like a king watching his throne crumble. "Congratulations," he spat, his smile forced. "Looks like you're in charge now." I leaned across the table, locking eyes with him. "No, we're not in charge. The community is. And it's time the community got the truth." Our first order of business was an audit. For years, the Hoe books had been guarded tighter than Fort Knox. But now, with a majority vote, we pried them open. What we found was worse than I imagined. Hundreds of thousands funneled to consulting fees, inflated contracts with shell companies, payoffs hidden in maintenance budgets, and buried among the numbers, payments to county officials, thinly veiled as donations. It wasn't just corruption. It was a blueprint of how they'd stolen everything from us. Daniel combed through it all, building case files thicker than bricks. "This," he said, slamming the folder shut, "is the nail in their coffin. But corruption doesn't go quietly." Within days, the threats started. Anonymous letters slipped under doors. Tires slashed in driveways. And late one night, a rock crashed through Henry's window with a note tied to it. "Back off, or else. Fear rippled through the group. Some wanted to quit, to walk away before things escalated further. But I couldn't. Not after everything they'd taken. "We've come too far," I told them, standing in the flickering light of the church basement. "They want us scared. They want us silent. But we're not going anywhere. Not until justice is served." The pressure mounted as our legal case gained traction. The judge, armed with the audit findings, ordered a freeze on construction. Developers were barred from touching another acre until the fraud allegations were resolved. For the first time, I drove past my family's farmland and saw silence. The bulldozers sat idle. The trucks were gone. The land, though scarred, was no longer bleeding. It was a small victory, but to me, it felt like the tide had finally turned. And yet, there was a part of me that wasn't satisfied, because freezing construction didn't erase what they'd done. It didn't give me back my soil, my heritage, and it didn't punish the ones who orchestrated this theft. No, they needed to feel what I felt, to lose what I lost. And that's when the idea took root. One evening, Daniel and I sat on the porch of the old farmhouse. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of fire. He sipped his coffee, tired but resolute. "You know," I said slowly, "there's more than one way to make them pay." He raised an eyebrow. "What are you thinking? They wanted to play games with property? Fine. Then let's play. They live in houses built on land they thought was theirs. But those houses can be sold legally, just like they sold my farmland." Daniel's eyes widened, then narrowed with intrigue. "You mean?" I nodded. "If the HOA has authority over community-owned assets, and we control the HOA, then every home they live in falls under our power. They stole my land. I'll sell theirs, legally, publicly, with the same cold smile they gave me." For a moment, Daniel was silent, weighing the madness of my words. Then, slowly, he grinned. Poetic justice. The plan was daring, maybe reckless, but it was possible. Step 1. Seize every loophole in the bylaws. Many of the homes in the community were technically HOA controlled due to unpaid dues, code violations, or liens quietly filed over the years. Under normal boards, these were threats used to intimidate residents. Under our board, they were opportunities. Step 2. Enforce those rules fairly, but firmly. For every corrupt board member still clinging to their mansion, for every developer hiding behind gated walls, we dug into their records. Unpaid fees, unapproved additions, skipped assessments. The same petty excuses they once used on us, we now turned on them. And step 3. Once the liens stacked high enough, the homes went up for sale. Legally, publicly. The very hammer they once swung at me was now in my hands. The first sale shook the entire community. A pristine 2-story house, once owned by a smug board treasurer who had voted to strip my farmland, was auctioned off after his years of unpaid dues came to light. I stood in the back of the auction hall, arms crossed, as the gavel slammed down. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried. The treasurer's face turned pale as the crowd cheered. One by one, their castles crumbled. But it wasn't just about revenge. Each sale put money back into the community, into fixing roads, restoring parks, repairing homes the old board had neglected. Neighbors who once feared the HOA now saw it working for them. The balance of power shifted. The corrupt were losing their grip, and the people were finally winning. Still, the developers weren't done. One night, as I drove back from an auction, headlights flared behind me. A black SUV tailed me down the dirt road, closer, closer, until it rammed my truck. I fought to keep control, swerving into the gravel shoulder. The SUV sped past, tires spitting dust, disappearing into the night. My hands shook on the wheel. They were desperate now. Dangerous. And if they thought fear would stop me, they hadn't been paying attention. By the time the 5th house sold, the old guard was in full retreat. Some fled town altogether. Others tried to sue, but their cases crumbled under the weight of the audit files. The county, once their ally, was now investigating them. And me? I was just getting started. Because while the farmland was still tied up in courts, the homes of those who wronged me were slipping through their fingers, one by one. The same way they stole my acres, I was stripping them of their square footage. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Because revenge isn't just about taking back what you lost. It's about making sure they'll never forget what they took. And I was going to make damn sure they remembered. It started like a trickle, one home here, another there. But by the time the third month rolled around, it was a flood. The very people who had laughed at me, who had mocked my family as they signed away my farmland, were now the ones watching auction signs hammered into their manicured lawns. Every sale wasn't just a transaction. It was a public spectacle. Neighbors gathered on sidewalks, whispering as moving trucks lined the streets. Once proud board members, once untouchable developers, now stood red-faced on porches as strangers carried their lives out in cardboard boxes. And me? I was there for every single one. The whole president was the first big fish to fall. He'd built his identity on power suits, fake smiles, and threats whispered in boardrooms. But beneath it all, he'd ignored his own dues for years, confident no one would ever dare call him on it. We called him on it. At the auction, I stood in the back, arms crossed, as his sprawling brick home went under the gavel. Sold. The auctioneer shouted, the word echoing like thunder. The president turned, his eyes finding me in the crowd. His face burned red, lips trembling, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked small. I didn't smile, didn't gloat. I just stared back, steady and cold, because this wasn't about me anymore. It was about justice. With each home that fell, the old guard's grip weakened. The treasurer who funneled consulting fees into his own pocket? Gone. The secretary who signed off on forged documents? Evicted. Even the smug developer's lawyer, who once smirked as he filed motion after motion to bury me, found himself buried under liens and fines. Every meeting of the new board became more like a reckoning. Files stacked high on tables, names highlighted, records scrutinized. Clara, her hands steady despite her age, would point at each file. This one owes 6 years of dues. This one built an illegal pool house. This one, she paused, lips tightening, was the one who voted yes on the farmland sale. And one by one, their homes became ours to sell. The community noticed. For years, the HOA had been a monster lurking over their shoulders, issuing fines for weeds, threatening liens for cracked driveways, harassing families into submission. Now, the monster was gone. Roads were repaired. The community park, once a forgotten patch of dirt, was cleaned up, swings repainted, benches rebuilt. The very money raised from selling the corrupt board members' homes was poured back into the neighborhood. People who once whispered in fear now greeted me on the street, shaking my hand, thanking me. Kids waved when I drove by. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something more than anger. I felt proud. But not everyone was celebrating. The developers were bleeding money. Without the board to protect them, their permits stalled. Their construction equipment sat rusting under tarps. And their investors, once bold and greedy, were pulling out, unwilling to sink another dime into what they now called a legal nightmare. Desperation makes men dangerous. And I was about to find out just how dangerous. One night, I returned home late from another meeting. The farmhouse was dark, the fields quiet under a silver moon. I pushed open the door, set my keys on the counter, and froze. The kitchen window was shattered. Glass crunched under my boots. I stepped carefully into the living room, my heart hammering. The furniture was overturned, drawers pulled out, papers scattered across the floor. Whoever had broken and hadn't been looking for cash. They'd been searching for files. I moved to the office. The cabinet where I kept copies of the audit documents was forced open, folders missing. My blood ran cold. They hadn't just come for me. They'd come for the proof. I called Daniel immediately. They broke in, I said, voice sharp. The files, some are gone. There was silence on the other end. Then Daniel cursed under his breath. They're desperate, he said. They know the investigation's closing in. If they can bury the evidence, maybe they think they can walk away clean. But they can't, right? I asked, gripping the phone tighter. No, Daniel replied firmly. We made backups, cloud drives, hard copies in safe deposit boxes. They can break into your house all they want. The truth isn't going anywhere. Relief washed over me, but only for a moment. Because if they were bold enough to break into my home, it meant they were running out of options. And cornered animals bite. The retaliation escalated. Henry's barn was set on fire. Thankfully, no one was hurt, but the message was clear. Clara's tires were slashed in broad daylight outside the grocery store. Even Marissa, the reporter, received anonymous threats warning her to stop digging or else. We met again in the church basement, faces grim but resolute. They're trying to scare us into silence, I said, my voice steady. But look around you. Has it worked? Heads shook. Eyes burned with determination. No, Henry growled, his fists clenched. If anything, it's made us stronger, and stronger we became. By the time the seventh house sold, the old board was no more. The developer's allies had scattered like leaves in the wind. The county prosecutor, armed with Daniel's files, launched a full investigation. Indictments were rumored to be coming. The newspapers picked up the story. Headlines splashed across the front page. HOA corruption exposed. Community fights back. From farmland to foreclosures. One man's battle against greed. The tide had turned so far that even those who once doubted me were now lining up to take my side. And yet, despite all the victories, one thing still burned inside me. The farmland. It was still scarred, still tied up in endless litigation. Every time I drove past, I felt the ache in my chest. Yes, I had taken their homes. Yes, I had made them bleed. But until the land was mine again, I wouldn't be whole. One evening, as I walked the fence line, I saw movement near the field. A black SUV parked in the shadows. Two men stepped out, suits glinting under the moonlight. I stayed hidden, watching as they surveyed the field, talking in hushed tones. One kicked the dirt, shaking his head. The other pointed toward the half-finished foundations, his voice sharp. It didn't take much to guess what they were saying. The project was dying. Investors were gone. Money was wasted. And I knew then, this wasn't just a legal battle anymore. This was a war. I turned away from the field, fists clenched. They thought they could scare me with break-ins, fires, threats. But all they'd done was prove how weak they really were. They were losing everything: money, homes, reputations. And I wasn't done yet. Because if they thought losing houses was painful, they hadn't seen what was coming next. The downfall of the HOA elite was almost complete. The board was gone. Their homes sold. Their reputations in ashes. But one thing still lingered like a thorn in my side: the farmland. 3,200 acres, stolen with lies and forged papers, still sat in limbo. The half-finished development rotted like a scar on the earth. Concrete foundations cracked under the sun, rebar rusted, weeds growing through gravel. Every time I drove past, it felt like the land was calling to me. Take me back. Finish this. Daniel knew it too. One evening, in his cluttered office, we sat surrounded by stacks of legal briefs. He tapped a thick folder, his face lined with exhaustion, but lit by a quiet fire. The prosecutor's building a case, he said. Indictments are coming, but the developers still hold the deeds. Until that changes, your land's still theirs. I clenched my fists. Then we change it. Legally, if possible. By force, if necessary. He gave me a sharp look. By force, I leaned forward, eyes hard. They used the hoe as a weapon. I used it back. Now it's time to finish what they started. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. The developers, desperate for cash, began liquidating assets. Their creditors circled like vultures, demanding payment. Foreclosure notices stacked on their desks. And then one of their shell companies, the very one that bought my farmland, defaulted on a massive loan. The bank seized control. And just like that, my family's land was going up for auction. The day of the auction, the courthouse steps were crowded. Reporters with cameras, Neighbors holding signs that read, "Return the land," and "Justice for farmers." Even strangers who'd read the headlines came to watch. I stood in the middle of it all, hat pulled low, heart pounding. The auctioneer cleared his throat, his voice booming across the crowd. 3,200 acres, formerly owned by Whitaker family, now foreclosed. Opening bid. My stomach tightened. Developers stood on the edges, pale and desperate. I could see them calculating, whispering, praying their investors hadn't abandoned them completely. The bidding began. Numbers flew, hands raised, the crowd buzzing with energy. I kept my face calm, my hands steady. I wasn't just bidding for land. I was bidding for generations of sweat, blood, and memory. The numbers climbed higher. My chest tightened. Could I keep up? Daniel, standing beside me, leaned close. "Hold steady. You're not alone." And then, like a miracle, neighbors started pledging support. Henry raised his voice. "I'll cover 10 acres worth." Clara added, "Take 20 from my savings." One by one, voices joined, pooling resources, raising hands with me. The developers tried to keep pace, but their bids faltered. Their money was gone, their backers silent. Finally, the auctioneer slammed his gavel. "Sold!" The crowd erupted in cheers. And just like that, the land was mine again. I drove out that evening, stopping at the edge of the field. The sun dipped low, painting the soil in gold. I stepped out, knelt down, and dug my fingers into the dirt. It felt alive again. It felt like home. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to breathe. But the story wasn't over. Because while I had the land, the developers still had fight left in them. And they weren't going quietly. The very next day, a lawsuit landed on my doorstep, claims of unlawful interference, harassment, even civil conspiracy. It was laughable. But it proved one thing. They still thought they could intimidate me. And that was their final mistake. We fought them in court. Every dirty trick they pulled, Daniel counted with evidence. Every false claim, we shredded with documents from the audits. Marissa's articles kept the public watching. Every move the developers made was dragged into the light. And the prosecutor? He struck like a hammer. Charges of fraud, bribery, racketeering, even conspiracy against property owners. Board members were led out in handcuffs. Developers were hauled before judges. Their empire crumbled, not with explosions or fire, but with the steady weight of justice grinding them into dust. The final blow came when the new HOA board, our board, voted unanimously to dissolve the association altogether. The community no longer needed it. Neighbors could govern themselves, free of the corruption that once strangled them. And with that vote, the weapon that had stolen my land was buried for good. I'll never forget the day the last developer left town. I was working in the fields when I heard the rumble of a moving truck. I looked up and saw the black SUV that had once tailed me at night. It rolled slowly past, loaded with boxes and furniture. Inside, the smug lawyer sat with hollow eyes, refusing to look at me. I didn't wave, didn't speak, just watched as they disappeared down the road, never to return. The land was quiet again. The community was free. And justice. Justice was mine. That night, I sat on the porch, looking out over the acres. Fireflies blinked in the distance, the air warm with the smell of fresh soil. Daniel sat beside me, sipping his coffee. "You did it," he said softly. "No," I replied, shaking my head. "We did it. All of us. They thought they could break us apart. But we stood together. And that's something they'll never understand." For a long while, we sat in silence, listening to the crickets. The fight was over. The war was won. And as the stars stretched across the night sky, I finally felt what I'd been chasing for so long. Peace. But I'll tell you this, if anyone, ever again, thinks they can steal from me, they better remember what happened the last time. Because I don't forgive. And I don't forget. The war was over. For months, maybe years, it had consumed every corner of my life. The land, the courts, the home meetings, the late nights planning in the church basement. It all felt like one long storm. And now, the clouds had parted. My farmland was back in my name. The corrupt board members were gone. The developers were bankrupt, their reputations shattered. And the hoe that once crushed this community was dissolved forever. But even as peace settled over the fields, I couldn't help but ask myself, was it worth it? The answer came to me one morning as I walked the edge of the fields. The sun was just rising, spilling light over acres of soil. For months, that land had been scarred, bulldozed, trampled, half buried under concrete dreams. But now, with time, the earth was healing. Tiny green shoots pushed through the dirt. The scars were fading, and in those fragile plants, I saw something bigger than myself. Resilience. The land had survived. And so had we. Neighbors began stopping by, not with fear in their eyes, but with hope. Henry brought over his grandson, pointing at the fields. "This is what happens when we stand together," he said, pride in his voice. Clara baked pies again, her laughter filling the farmhouse kitchen. Even Marissa, who had once come just chasing a story, now stayed as a friend, her notepad traded for a cup of coffee. The community wasn't just recovering, it was thriving. And I realized then, this fight had never been about me alone. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, bullied, or stripped of what was theirs. One evening, I held a small gathering at the farm. Long tables were set under string lights, neighbors sharing food and stories. Kids played tag in the fields. Music drifted through the air. At one point, Daniel stood, raising a glass. "To resilience," he said, "to standing up when the odds are impossible, and to proving that no amount of greed can take away what's truly ours." The crowd cheered, glasses clinking. I sat back, letting the sound wash over me, and for the first time in years, I felt at peace. But make no mistake, I hadn't forgotten. I still remembered the smirks of those board members as they signed away my land. I still remembered the bulldozers tearing through my family's soil. I still remembered the SUV tailing me at night, the break-in, the fire in Henry's barn. And I carried those memories like scars. Not because they haunted me, but because they reminded me never to let it happen again. Sometimes people ask me, "How did you win?" And the truth is, it wasn't just the audits, or the lawsuits, or even the home sales. It was persistence. It was standing up when everyone told me to sit down. It was refusing to let fear or intimidation break me. It was finding strength in community, in neighbors, in ordinary people who'd had enough. That's the real lesson. The hoe thought they could divide us. They thought money and power could crush us. But when we stood together, they didn't stand a chance. The farmland today is more than soil. It's a story. Every row of corn, every blade of grass whispers what we endured. That justice isn't always fast, and it sure isn't easy, but it comes for those who fight for it. I often sit on the porch, watching the sunset stretch across the fields. The cicadas hum. The breeze carries the scent of earth. And I think about the future. One day, my children will walk these acres. Maybe their children too. And when they do, I'll tell them this story. Not to scare them, not to fill them with bitterness, but to remind them, never let anyone take what is yours. Never let fear silence you. And never forget that justice, no matter how long it takes, is worth the fight. In the end, I didn't just take back my land. I took back my dignity. I took back my community. And I proved to everyone watching that even the biggest giants can fall. The hoe thought they could bury me, but they didn't know I was a seed. So if you ever find yourself facing the impossible, against corrupt powers, greedy hands, or those who think you're too small to matter, remember this. Stand firm, fight back, and never, ever give up. Because sometimes the greatest revenge is not just winning, it's making sure they never forget you won.